Welcome to the moment that changed everything, where we interview notable creative people to gain insights into how they got started and learn more about the moments that shaped them and their careers. Today we chat with Cameron Labine, lead writer for Ubisoft's Watchdogs Legion.
Make stuff, make games, make cool little interactive stories. You just learn so much by making it, and you for me, you enter a new sort of category. If you've actually seen something through to completion, even if it's something very simple, it's hard to finish things.
Cameron is also an accomplished film director and screenwriter, producing such films as Mountain Men and Control-Alt-Delete. We get into his past as a child actor, his beginnings in film, and as much as possible about creating video games with an R rating. I think you're going to like it. Cameron Labine, thanks for coming on the show for us today.
No problem. It's a pleasure.
I guess today is a little bit of a departure from the usual guests that we have on, because we usually have advertising people, creatives on the show. But today, of course, you come from a film and directing and gaming background. So I'm hoping that the thrust of this is going to be about getting to know what a writer at a gaming company does, a little bit about the writing process, the conceptualizing process, maybe a bit about strategy. But I guess the first question I wanted to ask was, I poked around a little bit online, and I can see that your brothers are kind of involved in show business as you are.
Yeah.
So just wanted to talk a little bit about that. And I think you grew up in Brampton, but I know that there's this other out west kind of thing that happens in your family. So tell us about that.
Yeah, so I grew up in Brampton until I was 14, and then my dad got a job on the West Coast, so dragged us out to the suburbs of Vancouver, and I finished high school there, and then ended up going to UBC in Vancouver for university, and just sticking around Vancouver for, until my mid-30s, and then making my way out to Toronto again.
So your eldest brother is Kyle?
No, I'm the eldest brother.
Okay.
But then the next one is Tyler, who is an actor. He's on an NBC hospital drama called New Amsterdam right now. He's done quite well, and they're shooting in New York. We're going to go see him in a couple weeks. And then my other brother lives here in Toronto. He's also an actor and a writer. His name is Kyle Labine.
I noticed on Kyle's it says something about Fairview, Alberta. So, unless that's wrong, and the only reason I twigged on that was because I know that Jordan Peterson is from Fairview, and I was like, wow, he's from the same small town as him.
I don't know what that would have been about. Maybe he visited Fairview, but he certainly never lived there.
Sure. Let's talk about your background in film. So, how did that come about? How did your interest come about? When was the first time you wanted to make films?
Yeah, really good question. I had to think about this a little bit because I knew it was going to come up, but. Because I really kind of, as long as I can kind of remember, it was a thing that I wanted to do. I actually think in grade 5 or 6, the provincial Ontario government did this aptitude test that everybody in my school took, and it kind of, you filled in a bunch of questions, and it actually spat out a bunch of career possibilities.
Oh, wow.
And one of them was film director. I think another one was auctioneer, and some really weird ones. But anyway, that film director one kind of just stuck in my head for some reason. And I was doing drama classes at the YMCA and stuff. And my mom was told by all these people that her 3 sons, should be in commercials or whatever. So she dragged us downtown Toronto and got us an agent when I was about 10 or 11. Wow. And all 3 of us started acting. With various degrees of success. I wasn't one of the more successful of the 3, but I booked some stuff and did some child acting, and I was always really fascinated by the people, the crew. I didn't even know what any of them did really, but they had walkie-talkies, and they just seemed way cooler than the actors and way more important than the actors in a way. And I think I just became really fascinated by the people who were making the stuff. And I just got it in my head from a really young age that I wanted to do that. And I didn't really know what that was, but my dad had a camcorder that I started sort of making videos with my friends in the neighborhood and making movies. And then by the time it was time to start thinking about going to university, I knew that I wanted to go to film school, and it just kind of went from there.
So with your parents, are they from creative fields? Because I think it's a big decision to put your kids in front of the camera and all the we've heard the stories about all that kind of stuff and whether or not you're comfortable with it, but sounds like they were.
Yeah. So no, they're not from a creative background at all. It was, I think, a bit of a controversial decision, actually. Now I've caught on to that in the later years, that my dad maybe wasn't so stoked on it, but my mom really was. So no, I mean, I'm sure there were some long discussions about it, and I think probably, now they probably have some feelings about that moment, that choice being a pretty pivotal one in the lives of their children, and I would certainly think pretty long and hard about whether I wanted to introduce my child to showbiz, because it's really sexy and seductive and
Right.
hard to shake, I think, once you get a taste. But for better or for worse, it sort of became what me and my two brothers do.
So are you still on that side of the camera? You still do that or no?
No.
No.
No, it's been a long time. Yeah.
And do your brothers dabble in the on getting the other side, like the directing and writing side?
Yeah, they both are interested in writing. They aren't they haven't done a lot of produced stuff, but my brother Tyler and I are kind of like creative partners. My two features that I've made, he's been the lead actor in, and he was really involved in the conceptualizing of the stories and the reading scripts and giving notes, and we still, we've developed several TV projects together, and so I'm more the one who usually puts pen to paper, but he's definitely kind of a writer sensibility. And my brother Kyle also does a lot of writing. He actually is really interested in sports. He does sports blogging, and so yeah, I mean, he's got the writing bug as well.
So for the writing, now, how did you make that foray into writing? Did you have a mentor, or did you pursue schooling for that, or?
Yeah, so in film school, in a kind of classic way in the 90s, basically they gave you a 16 mil camera and made you buy some film and gave you an editing machine and showed you how to load the film and said, go out and make your movie. But there was no instruction on how to write a script, literally zero. So that within the film program at the University of British Columbia. So I sort of was the only one in my class who kind of was like, well, I think I need to learn how to write if I'm gonna write and direct a film. So I sort of sought out some screenwriting courses in the creative writing department that really helped me. And I think I just sort of, over those few years of film school and afterwards making some shorts, I kind of realized that the writing was a little more what I was maybe suited to and interested in, and selfishly think is probably the more important of the of those two jobs, although it doesn't often get the credit. But I think if you don't have the script, if you don't have the story, then you got nothing. So yeah, I just kind of became a lot more interested in the writing over sort of gradually.
So as you started that, were there any individuals who served as mentors for you, or you must have gotten some pretty positive feedback on how you were doing and your
some
start?
not
Yeah. Or some
a lot
constructive
of
criticism.
negative feedback too.
Yeah.
I actually did have a wonderful mentor, a filmmaker out of Vancouver named Lynn Stopkowicz, who made a really big breakout film for the Vancouver film scene called Kissed in the 90s. It was Molly Parker's big break, where she played a necrophiliac who worked in a funeral parlor. It's a very cool film that kind of broke the Vancouver film scene in a lot of ways. She and I became good friends, and she helped produce my first feature, really taught me how to write, and still is my mentor.
So, what was the film that really, would you say, really was the first breakout kind of thing that you did that you could look at and kind of go, that was when the tide turned for you?
Yeah. So I think I really would have to trace it back to my first short film out of film school. It was, I had no idea how I was going to proceed sort of after film school. I made a couple of shorts in film school that were pretty good and won the best film at the our little film festival at the film school, but who gives a shit? It's like that's not much of a calling card. So I wanted to make like a proper short film, and about 1 or 2 years after film school, I found some interesting producers, and they liked an idea I had, and we applied for various grants and got a decent little budget together and made the film, and it won a bunch of awards and really kind of gave me something to stand on. Like, it was really the first thing where people kind of took notice, and then when it came time to make my first feature, a lot of the same people who had greenlit that short greenlit my feature, at Telefilm Canada and BC Film and other sort of public agencies who were aware of me and sort of invested in me because they had sort of banked on me in this short, and so those relationships ended up being really key.
Let's talk a little bit about that. I think a lot of people from the outside see film and television as it's who you know kind of business, and getting projects off the ground is a lot about talking and finding the right people.
Yeah.
It seems like something that's very hard to do, but how do you break into it? How do you talk to the producers that are going to help you produce the things that you create?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's when you talk about working in Canada, I think it's like very different kind of landscape than maybe almost anywhere. Well, actually probably not. I mean, it's probably similar to a lot of smaller countries who have a sort of publicly funded kind of cultural industry, but very different from the U.S. So in Canada, I really feel like, in a way, that kind of like who you know thing is a smaller deal. I mean, it's there's really these systems in place to try to sort of help people who have good ideas and help them get their stuff made, and increasingly help people who are sort of more marginalized. So I think in Canada, it's really we've got this real blessing of a system where you can really just sort of apply through these agencies, and I'm not saying there isn't some artfulness to getting your thing on the top of the pile and getting noticed by the people who make those decisions, but at least there's sort of a system, an accountable system in place, whereas in Hollywood, I think it's very much like there's nobody feels sort of that they owe anyone anything. But I think here, the people who end up getting these projects made are they're that's taxpayer money that they are held accountable for. So I just think in Canada, if you're a person trying to start making films or making whatever, you really need to avail yourself of those publicly funded programs.
I feel like there would be a big difference between the U.S. market and the Canadian market as it relates to this. I think when a lot of people think about the funding that goes on with Canadian films, there's a lot that has to do with Canadian content or things that are uniquely Canadian. And I'm sure there's strategizing going on when it comes to making films that touch on certain aspects of the culture in order to move it up the pile. Would that be true?
Yeah, I mean, I think it gets overstated a bit. Like, thinking of my two films, I mean, there's nothing.
Right.
There's nothing.
Canadian about it.
There's no beavers in them, like they're Canadian because I'm Canadian and they're set in Canada, but they're not like. It's not overtly set in Canada. I think what they're more interested in, the people who make these decisions and greenlight these projects, is Canadian talent. Are enough of the key creatives Canadian and Canadian voices getting a platform. I don't think there's this sort of like checklist of maple syrup, Canadian culture, but I could be wrong about that.
I feel when I was growing up, I feel like you could spot a Canadian production a mile away. And that was one thing that I always wondered, and I'm glad to be talking to someone like you, because I'm sure you're going to have insight on this. But what was it about Canadian, and it seems not true anymore, but it seemed as though when I was growing up and I saw something that was Canadian, you could almost see it immediately, and and it seemed to be something about the way the film looked,
Yeah.
even, that I was like, that's a Canadian production.
Yeah.
I don't know if it was a budget thing or not, but the U.S. production seemed way more slick.
Yeah, I think it probably basically was a budget thing.
Yeah. Can't afford the lights on this one.
Yeah, basically, and I think like the democratization of the gear, like these two like DSLRs that are shooting this, like that, these are beautiful pieces of technology so it evened the playing field a lot, I think, over the years, and now, people shoot films on these kinds of cameras and they look pretty great. And so, yeah, I think it basically came down to crappy equipment and, yeah.
Do you feel like you have some cachet as a Canadian when you did go into the U.S. market? Is there something about it that makes you a little bit more unique than everybody trying to make things in the U.S.?
No, I don't. I don't think they're.
Or is it a detriment?
Yeah, no, I don't think they're particularly impressed that you're Canadian. I mean, but one thing that, again, I'll come back to, like, Canadians are able to get stuff made. Excuse me, if you really want to, there's a lot of resources out there, and I think that is impressive. So now if I go to the U.S., I have 2 produced feature films, which is really kind of impressive. A lot of people in Hollywood just are in development land for their whole careers, or and getting actually produced credits is kind of a big deal. So I think that is kind of impressive that you have actual work you can show.
Would it be fair to say that the writing of the script is the thing that does make it far more sellable than anything else?
I think no. I don't think that.
Really?
Sadly.
I really wanted you to say it's all about the writing. Sorry.
No. It starts with that. I mean, if you don't have a strong script or a strong outline or whatever, I mean, you're not going to get anywhere. But in terms of what actually can get your film made, I think it's a lot cast, frankly. Getting the right cast that can trigger the right money, that can get enough eyeballs on it, and I think that's kind of often what it comes down to. But yeah, if you don't have the strong backbone of the script, then you're not even going to get that far.
I guess maybe perhaps naive of me to think that might be the case, because I imagine the studio is like a big part of it is that it's saleable and people are gonna watch it and they're gonna pay for it, and et cetera, and it's a business, I guess, at the end of the day.
Yeah. I mean, even in Canada, I mean, they still want people to see these films. They want these films to do well. Right. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think what producers are looking at when they look at a script is, will actors like this?
Want to do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's talk about the transition from being a writer in film and television to writing games, because I see those as completely different worlds. Is that accurate?
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, yes and no, but yeah, they're quite different for sure.
How did that come about? How did you make this foray into the gaming world?
So, I mean, I kind of just was in the right place at the right time, like a lot of stories, I guess. But I had worked a little bit at EA Sports in Vancouver, doing actually some like marketing sizzle reels for the FIFA games, which are the biggest video games in the world, kind of, I think, actually. So just making like sexy marketing shots of goals and saves and cool passes and stuff like that. And because I had a directing background, and then moved to Toronto, and basically went to a Fringe play at the Fringe show and ran into a friend of a friend, a director named David Footman. And they happened to be looking for a writer for what I later found out was an Assassin's Creed game, which is a very big brand. And the fact that I had sort of pedigree as a writer and I had worked a little bit in a games studio was kind of enough to catch his interest, read my stuff, and eventually hire me to write that game.
Did you have an inkling in that little bit of dipping your toe into that world on how to be, what was going to be a strength for you as a writer? Did you know going in, or was there a big learning curve when you first got into the real thing?
I mean, there was a big learning curve. I mean, I was kind of lucky in a way in that the material that I wrote for that game was quite cinematic. It was quite sort of pretty linear kind of storytelling that I was able to kind of use my toolbox that I had from screenwriting to basically apply to that game. The games I've worked on since, I've been able to use that traditional skill set a lot less. But it was, I mean, there was definitely some stuff that I really had to learn, things like, I mean, to be frank, story is not really the top,
The number one.
the king in games. It's increasingly important, and good games usually have very good stories. But learning to share that space with gameplay and art, and it's sort of a very different landscape. So I had to learn that, but I was not expecting to fall in love with it at all. I thought it was a great gig, and I was actually trying to get my second feature made, and it was sort of about a year. The timing was about right, and I did actually finish that gig, go off and make my second film, and then they were like, "Come back when you're done." So that's what I did, and because I was basically hooked at that point.
Interesting. So, so you're now was there a ton of other writers working on Assassin's Creed, or?
Yeah, there were maybe not a ton, a half dozen at least, but I was the only one in Toronto. Most of them were working on the sort of main campaign in Montreal. The Ubisoft Montreal studio is the biggest video game studio in the world. There's like 4,000 people there. And we were kind of the little brother, and still kind of are the little brother,
Right.
but we're getting bigger. We're able to fight back. And we were kind of given a little sort of corner of the game. Not a little corner of the game, a big corner of the game, and kind of given a lot of autonomy to just, basically me and David Footman, the director, who hired me, were kind of given this mandate that was kind of like decoupled from the rest of what those writers were doing in Montreal. It was set in Paris during the French Revolution, and so the main story had a few sort of characters from the history, but it was kind of a love story mostly, and with invented characters. And they basically said, "You guys can have the rest of the French Revolution. Like,
Wow.
take other characters. Nobody's really using Robespierre. Find some cool stories and make these sort of about a dozen to 15 sort of short stories about the French Revolution that you could play through." So that was really, really cool.
How does the structure of writing work for games? Because I mean, I have very limited experience. My kids play Fortnite like crazy, but other
Not a
than
lot
that,
of writing in Fortnite.
Yeah.
Dance moves.
Yeah.
I don't know how you write the dance moves. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, these stories that you talk about, I mean, I envision the way gaming works is that there's a story part that kind of sits on top of the actual playing of the game, and you then it moves along in that way. So when how do you structure your writing so that, I'm assuming that there's an arc, just like the level of games moves up 2, 3, 4, and 5, however that ascends. So I envision that's what you're doing. It's kind of, I envision as I stare at the structure of it, that it's a layer on top of the actual playing. Is that true?
Often you're right. Usually it is that. I think when it's at its best, it's a little more integrated. Decisions you make, ways you play in that gameplay layer, which is the majority of what you're kind of doing in a game, change the story and mesh with the story, become part of the story. But often, what it is a little bit more like do a thing, shoot a guy, hack a thing, climb this thing, get to the top, hit Y, and now we're going to give you the next movie scene. And that's pretty cool in a lot of ways. But what's cooler is if the shooting the guy, hack the thing, there's decisions in there that feel like they're leading into that movie scene story. They're not two separate things. They're feeding into one another. So that movie scene at the top of the tower, when you climb up there, it might be a bit different depending on how you how you got up there. That's sort of that's kind of the holy grail everyone's kind of trying to work towards.
And do you, as a writer, do you have to have fairly deep knowledge of what is possible from the gameplay action in order to know, and then how do you keep up with that?
Well, I play the game a lot, for one thing. I mean, one thing that I've had to learn is, as I've sort of really invested in this industry and decided to really like put down roots in it, is that I'm as much a game developer as anyone else on the floor. I'm not sort of this satellite writer anymore. Or at least I maybe that's how I started, but now I know that I have to know the game mechanics. I have to know how the NPCs will react to different things. I have to know everything about the game to be able to write it well. So, I mean, luckily I work for a company and a studio that really respects narrative a lot in their games and story in their games. So I'm often in meetings where I'm like, what the hell am I? I never thought I would be in this meeting, but I'm glad I'm in it, because there's elements of the game being discussed that really will affect how I write it. Yeah.
Interesting. So, how is the writing room? I'm saying writing room as if I know one exists, but would it be fair to say that the writing is the thing that starts the whole thing, and then how the game actually works happens after? Does it? What's the conceptualizing of the game? What's that look like?
Yeah. So. Again, I can kind of only speak to my own experiences on 3 games, all with Ubisoft. So that's one thing I'll say about the game industry as a disclaimer, is it's the Wild West. It's a very young art form, and still finding its legs, still finding its form, I think. So in a lot of ways, every game that gets made is kind of reinventing the wheel and doing it in their own way. It's not like film and television where maybe we've had like 100 years to kind of settle into a way of making, making these things. So anyway, that said, on our game and at our studio, it basically starts with a core group of maybe 10 to 12 people, of which the writer is one. Art director would be another one. Gameplay director who's thinking about the challenges of the gameplay and what you'll actually be doing to proceed in the game. Creative director, some producers, who all kind of work together in kind of a blue sky sort of way for quite a while. We do research trips. The game that I'm just finishing up now takes place in London, and it's sort of a near future London. So we did several research trips to London all together, that kind of core group, meeting people. Ubisoft's head office is in Paris, and there's a whole sort of subdivision that's dedicated to research, and they kind of like set up interviews with different people who might they call themselves fixers. They kind of broker interesting meetings. We met with sort of hackers who basically wouldn't want their faces shown. Like, my game is a lot about hacking. We met with ex-MI6 agents. Wow. We met with private military companies. We met with all kinds of interesting people. So there's that kind of like incubation kind of small team. And that's where a lot of the big picture kind of like narrative comes out of, like, where's it going to be set? What's the main conflict going to be? And so in that way, that kind of storytelling is definitely sort of one of the priorities that's sort of leading the charge. At some point, though, things like gameplay become kind of take a little more priority, and narrative is sort of not sort of in the driver's seat, I wouldn't say, but if you're smart, and I think my team is, you're always keeping them in the loop, consulting, getting a kind of like a back and forth, tossing the kind of ball back and forth, like, what if you could do this in the game? And we're like, oh yeah, well, we could, we could justify that this way. That kind of brings up an interesting narrative idea for our world, and you're kind of going back and forth like that. But it's not so much like television, where it's like a writer's room that are up there kind of in their ivory tower, kind of like pounding out the story, and it goes down to everyone else, and it's like, this is the Bible. There's a lot more kind of back and forth with a lot of different departments.
Are there multiple core ideas that come through that initial process? In other words, people will come to the table with different ideas and completely different games that, if they were fully realized, would be completely different. And are there many of those, or do you guys glob onto something fairly quickly, and if it feels like everybody is in agreement that it's a good idea, it's then pursued wholeheartedly?
No, there was a lot of competition for premises for the game between that group of 12 or whatever. But I mean, one thing is, like, at least on the 3 games I've worked on at Ubisoft, they were existing brands. So, we knew we were making, on this game currently, we knew we were making the next Watchdogs, the 3rd Watchdogs game. So we knew it had to be kind of about hacking, and it had to be kind of like a present or near future kind of setting. It wanted to be about technology. Those are brand sort of fundamentals. But then things like, what city is it going to be in? Who are you going to be fighting? Who are the bad guys? What are the themes we're sort of interested in exploring? Those things, and what every Ubisoft game, and probably every game period, wants to have what we call a breakthrough. Technically, usually, like some kind of like, oh, no game has done this, and that's another big part of that pitch package. But yeah, we were pitching all kinds of different cities, all kinds of different world conflicts, cities underwater, cities, like all kinds of stuff. And we landed on sort of a near future London that's sort of gone through this sort of economic and cultural collapse, and then Brexit happened a few months later, and we were like, okay, this was a good choice.
Yeah, I was going to lead to my next question, which we touched on a little bit off of before we got started here, which was, does the studio want to pick up on themes that are relevant to people now? You'd mentioned that Brexit happened, which kind of helped it along. Is there this hindsight looking back and sort of going, that was the perfect kind of idea for right now? Or is that a push from the studio where they're like, we need a game that revolves around these themes?
Yeah. It's a big company, so it's a big enough company that there are sort of different schools of kind of thought on this. So there's some push to kind of, not alienate players by getting too political, I guess you would say, keeping things a little bit lighter, maybe not so, you're not getting preachy, and then other elements within the company who are much more open to that kind of, the game having something to say about the world we live in now, and I think in this game, there's enough appetite for both of those kinds of things that the creative director of my game, a guy named Clint Hawking, who comes very much as advertised as a guy who is political, is interested in making games that are meaningful and have something to say about the society that we live in. I think that once he was hired and they knew, okay, well, this is gonna push in a direction of having some message in it. So sorry, I think I just rambled on that. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
I first of all, I think it does in part, and I think, as an outsider looking at that industry, I do think about the evolution of gaming and responsibility and the responsibilities that come with that. And I think, if we're all familiar with this, this ongoing dialogue that speaks to particularly children who consume the game, and whether or not there are behavioral effects that are a byproduct of being so immersed in something that seems to continually get more and more real. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So, what are the ethics part of that? Do you guys talk about that? I always see gaming as something that always is pushing the limits and everything from the way women are treated in games and so on. So, how much of your discussions revolve around that, and how far is too far?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we discuss that kind of thing a lot, especially what you were talking about how women are represented, how minorities are represented, how people of different abilities are represented. Like that is super core to our sort of ethical discussion around the game. In terms of like content and kids, we write our games with an age group in mind, and we depend on the ratings board to let parents know what is if this game is appropriate or not. And certainly the game I'm working on now will almost certainly be 18 plus, and we write the game for adults. We write the game themes that we feel will resonate with adults, so and the content, some of it is very adult, we really take seriously those ratings, and we have to, and Ubisoft really believes in that system,
And there's a submission. I'm assuming there's a governing body, there's a submission, and then they come back with sometimes notes that sort of say, hey, you can't do that, or you have to alter something.
Sometimes they do, especially if you're trying to get a certain rating. We're going for basically the top. We are planning on having sort of the highest rating, the 18 plus rating. So there isn't a whole lot that they would come back with and say this isn't appropriate for adults. But different countries have really unusual verboten things. Like, for example, in Japan, I think in Japan you can't show disembodied bodies. You can't show a body missing an arm or an arm without a body. That will basically get your game banned. and some countries in the Middle East have pretty draconian restrictions on sexual homosexuality, things like this. So the company has to sort of make a decision at some point. Are we going to do versions of them for these countries? Are we going to just change the whole game to come in line with these countries' restrictions, or are we going to say we're just not? That's fine. We won't sell the game in this country.
Gosh, I would think that dismemberment would be like the entry level for an 18 plus kind of gaming scenario.
Yeah, there's cultural nuances that I don't claim to understand, but
wouldn't it be incredibly expensive for those versions to be done?
Yes.
Yeah. So they really have to look at the math of it and sort of think, that's a market that we want to sell in, and that's worth the revision.
Yeah. For example, that Japanese version, that Japanese example, we just made sure the game would be okay as it was in Japan.
Okay.
Yeah.
So as I understand it, through our mutual friend Tina Mertzke, that you were at a gaming convention, and you were signing autographs and
Fan Expo last
Fan
weekend.
Expo.
Yeah, it's not just games; it's
okay.
All kinds of fans of all kinds of different movies, comics, whatever. Yeah.
Have you done that before?
I went to E3, which is a little bit more of like a trade show. It's the biggest trade show in the gaming industry. It's in Los Angeles in June, and that's a little bit different. It's a little bit more like, it's less sort of fan-y, and although there are fans there cosplaying and whatever, it's a little bit more like industry people. So that was my first one there. I was really like kind of got a sense of what these sort of giant Comic-Con type events could be like. And then this one last weekend in Toronto was definitely like fan focused, like crazy costumes, rabid fan base. So I'm just sort of dipping my toe in it right now.
Is it weird for people to approach you and want you to sign something?
I don't find it weird. I find it flattering. I mean, I find it really interesting, like that coming from film, like no one ever asked me to sign a copy of my, my movies.
Right.
They've asked the actors in the movies, sometimes for autographs, obviously. But the fact that the stars of the show are like the lead writer and the art director last weekend, we were the ones signing posters and people lined up to meet us. It's sort of like there's something really cool about that where they kind of, the fan base recognize that the developers are that kind of the stars, you know. No, it was really flattering, honestly.
What would they say when they approached you? Did you get interesting questions from them?
I mean, they mostly kind of want spoilers, frankly, like about the game that we're making. They kind of want to know, what happens, or is this character going to show up? Things that I kind of can't really. So we just we kind of tease and say, you're gonna have to play the game to find out, but we think you're gonna like it. The big thing with this one, and we can talk a little bit about the game if you want, but is our big breakthrough is that you can play as anyone. There's no central hero in our game. You are sort of dropped into this near future London. You can go around the world, and you see all these what would usually be non-playable characters all around living their lives, and you can choose any of them to sort of target and help with a problem to bring them into your sort of hero group, and then you can play as them. So you could make a team of playable characters that were all grandmas. You could do like the Golden Girls team, or you could do the Attack the Block team with all like sort of like kind of street smart kids from Brixton. Like you can really like shape your own hero group. So a lot of the people wanted to know if that's actually true. Because that's what we sort of have really built all our publicity on, and it is true. But people are so amazed that they're kind of looking to poke holes. They're like, but it can't really be true. And we're like, no, it's actually true. So. And
that would be, as you spoke of earlier, that would be an innovative type of thing that would really make Ubisoft look incredibly amazing for that level of creativity for players.
Yeah, that's our breakthrough. Like I said, every game needs a breakthrough. That's definitely our breakthrough. We call it play as anyone. There's no hero on the front of the box. There's no grizzled white dude with a 5 o'clock shadow and an AK-47. Like, we're not going to tell you who your heroes are. You decide who your heroes are. So that's pretty ambitious.
With that in mind, how do you see the industry evolving? What do you see in the next 10 to 15 years happening in the gaming creation industry?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that with games we're going to get more and more different kinds of games. I think that the sort of the kind of standard format of the shooters or the the sort of action adventure kind of games, there's going to be more as kind of the audience, the player sort of base becomes more diverse. I think we're going to find, like there's a very popular game out there right now that's basically about building an underwater sort of research base, and there's no shooting. There's just exploring underwater as a scuba diver and finding things you need to build the base. And this is a very popular game, and I think you're going to see more and more of that kind of thing where it's not so much. Not that I have a problem with running around shooting people. I like playing games like that, but I like playing other kinds of games too. And so games where you're sort of interacting in more in different ways than violently necessarily. And I also think that narratively, games are going to get much more sophisticated. For example, I went to this great immersive theater show in New York called Sleep No More a little while ago, and it's like basically 7 floors of an old abandoned hotel where a cast of like 30, 40 people is just sort of all at the same time on different floors sort of going through this story. And you can kind of just wander around and sort of pay attention to this, like follow this person as they go from floor 2 to 3 to meet someone who you maybe saw in a scene earlier. And I think there's going to be a lot more of this kind of storytelling where it's like really the player has a lot of choice about what they're interested in, and and which direction the story goes in. So, I mean, that's for sure what we want to do. We want to give the player more and more freedom to shape the story, and I think the industry is going to go in that way in general too.
Would the win, or would a I have to imagine that, because I think everybody sees gaming as a certain, if not a demographic, definitely a psychographic, as it relates to the people who really find it something that they invest a lot of time in and do. It's almost, it's part of them. Just like, for instance, older people maybe using smartphones, where now we see a lot of people who are 70 with a smartphone and navigating that pretty well. I have to imagine that what you're speaking about now, to have someone who is like well into their 60s involved in some kind of gaming would be pretty miraculous.
Or is it that will happen? I mean, that's already happening, obviously, but a small minority of 60-year-olds are playing games. But certainly, when I'm 60, I'll be playing games, and a lot of my peers will be too. So yeah, I mean. And by then, the 20-year-olds playing games, I think, will be probably playing much more sophisticated games than I could ever imagine, because it'll be second nature to them,
What do you think of this? I'm going to say there's this judgment, perhaps, from certain people about gamers. There's this often, this term of someone being nerdish or being a nerd for playing games and so on. What do you think about that? Do you get people who, vocally kind of say, oh, you do that thing for adolescent nerds and
Not too much, honestly. Like, I think that's a bit of an outdated stereotype. I think we're kind of moving beyond it. I mean, it's pretty cool to be a nerd now. The cool kids play games now too, not just the nerdy kids. Right. Or I guess another way to say that is I mean, everybody's kind of nerdy, I think, increasingly. Yeah. So no, I mean, I think that's a bit of a...
That's gone away.
I think it's dying, yeah. Certainly a lot of the people that I know who play games don't fit into some kind of cartoonish stereotype of the dude in his mom's basement or whatever. I mean, I'm not saying that those people don't exist, but games are a lot more mainstream than that now.
What would your advice be for someone who is interested in getting involved in something like that you do? What would be the avenues that you would suggest they take in getting involved?
Yeah, so it's the same thing that I would say to someone who was trying to get involved in film or television. And it's what I did too, which is like make stuff. Like there's, in the same way that maybe when I was in my 20s, these digital cameras coming out made it suddenly possible to make a short film without going into debt, Now it's similar for games. There's a lot of things, a lot of sort of out of the box platforms out there. One that comes to mind is Twine, which is a sort of a text-based game engine that is you can learn in half an hour and make your own, choose your own adventure story. Usually when writers approach me about wanting to get into games, they ask me what I look for in a writer, and I tell them I want to read something traditional, something conventional, like a screenplay, and I want to play something. I want to literally play something you've made, and that can be something you make in 2 hours on something like Twine, or something more involved than that. But really, I think the best thing is to have work you can show, and it's really not hard. Well, I'm not saying it's not hard, but there's no excuse that you can't access the technology, really, or it's hard to make that excuse. So make stuff, make games, make cool little interactive stories. Get together with an artist if you're a writer, find an artist who can make cool sort of stills that go along with your writing, or do some really rough animation, or do sound recording, make a cool soundscape to go with your sort of interactive story. yeah, you just learn so much by making it. And for me, you enter a new sort of category. If you've actually seen something through to completion, even if it's something very simple, it's hard to finish things.
Right.
And it's brave to put it out there and let people play it or read it or whatever. So for any young person interested in breaking in, make some stuff.
I'll wrap up by asking you, well, you can answer this, I guess, two different ways. What are your goals in terms of where you would like to see yourself as your career grows, or what is it that you're working on now that you find really engaging and exciting, and it's something that just gets you amped?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the game that I'm just finishing up, Watchdogs Legion, which comes out in March, just absolutely rocked me to my core in terms of how much creativity it asked of me, in terms of innovation. Like, one thing to be able to tell a story. It's hard enough to just sort of tell a story, I think.
Right.
It's stories are hard to master. It's another to try to give players a huge amount of agency in terms of how they experience your stories, what order they experience your stories, who their heroes are going to be in our game. Like, if you recruit that grandma drinking tea, her afternoon tea, bring her into your group, you can go into that next cinematic cutscene, movie scene with her as the hero, and she's going to play across from the villain, and it could have been her, it could have been that, street kid that I talked about, it could be any number of people. So that kind of like giving the player that kind of choice, like, we're not going to tell you who you want to fantasize about being. That is, to me, super, super exciting. So I'm interested in continuing to innovate in that direction, where we're giving the player so much choice that they're having that reaction that those fans were having at Fan Expo last weekend, where they were like, come on, it can't really be true. And we're like, no, it's true. We worked really hard. So I hope you guys like it. So yeah, that kind of innovation is what gets me out of bed in the morning. I can pretty safely say most days that I'm at work, I'm trying to solve a problem that I'm pretty sure no one else in the world is trying to solve exactly. So that's exciting to me. And then in terms of where I want to see my career going, I increasingly sort of see myself as kind of a maybe like a mentor is not quite the right word, but like kind of a leader of younger writers, who I can kind of like point in the right direction, maybe set higher level kind of vision, but give younger voices like the reins to tell their stories, because there's so many talented young people out there with stories bursting out of them that, I've gotten to sort of like tell a lot of mine, and I want to keep, there's still some more to tell, but I want to stay in the interactive space and work with young developers who are really like hungry for to tell their stories and kind of help shape those stories with them. That's kind of, in a vague way, how I kind of see the sort of next half of my career.
Cameron, thanks so much for taking the time to sit down and talk with us. I know that our listeners are going to get a great insight from what you've talked about today, and we just really appreciate that you've taken the time.
No problem. It was fun. Super fun.
This episode has been brought to you by the National Advertising Challenge, North America's only brief-based challenge that sends winners to Cannes, France.